Welcome back, Atavos students. I am absolutely thrilled to kick off today's masterclass with you all. We're diving straight into Chapter 13, and let me tell you, the stakes in modern software engineering have quite literally never been higher. I mean, think about it. Our societies, our governments, global financial systems, none of them could function without massive professional software systems. But with all that reliance comes a pretty terrifying threat: cyber attacks. So today we're unpacking secure systems design and security testing. Mastering this stuff isn't just about acing your exams. It's about figuring out how to build the vital, resilient infrastructure of tomorrow. Let's get right into it. So here's the game plan for our explainer today. We'll start with a quick introduction to secure systems, move on to architectural design trade-offs, and then look at secure design and programming. After that, we're stepping into the security testing battle, and finally, we'll wrap up with a high-energy Chapter 13 exam summary. All right, Section 1, Introduction to Secure Systems, Designing from the Ground Up. Let's just go ahead and shatter a really dangerous misconception right out of the gate. You cannot, and I repeat, cannot build a massive software system and then just casually decide to slap some security on at the very end. It's a terrible idea. Security cannot be an afterthought. Bolting it onto a finished system is super expensive, and honestly, it rarely ever works. It's kind of like building a house out of wet cardboard and then trying to secure it by slapping a heavy-duty steel padlock on the front door, right? The structure itself is fundamentally flawed. So, in software engineering, security absolutely must be engineered from day one, woven deeply right into those initial design phases. Moving on to Section 2, Architectural Design Trade-offs, Protection versus Distribution. Whenever you're designing an architecture to keep a system secure, you're immediately going to slam into a massive trade-off: protection versus distribution. It's a classic balancing act. With protection, you're looking at a centralized architecture, basically putting all your critical assets in one basket so you can build massive, expensive, overlapping layers of defense around them. The catch: if an attacker actually breaches that one location, you lose everything. It's a total catastrophe. On the flip side, we've got distribution. This is where you decentralize. You take your assets and replicate the data across multiple different servers. Yes, it's a headache to manage, way more complex, but it's incredibly resilient because a single breach doesn't bring down the whole shebang. Now, let's look at what happens when you go with that centralized protection route. It absolutely requires multiple defensive layers. Let's say you're centralizing healthcare data, like the Medicare system we've talked about in the textbook. You have to stack your protections. Right at the top, you've got platform-level protection. That's your bouncer. It controls access to the computer or OS itself, handling all the system authentication. Drill down a bit and you hit application-level protection, which manages the user logins to the actual software and handles database authorization. Then right at the core is record-level protection. This is super granular. It checks if a user is explicitly allowed to view a specific patient's record, usually relying on heavy encryption. So a hacker would literally have to smash through all 3 independent walls just to get to the data.
But what if we go the other way? Imagine a globally distributed system, like an international equity trading platform. In this setup, all those critical assets, the user accounts, trading histories, equity data, they're scattered. They are distributed across servers in New York, London, Frankfurt, and Hong Kong. By spreading the data geographically, you massively shrink the blast radius of a localized attack. If someone hits the London server with a massive denial of service attack and it goes down, well, the whole system doesn't just collapse. The other nodes can pick up the slack and keep essential services running. It's a textbook example of trading tight, centralized control for unbeatable, decentralized resilience.
Okay, on to Section 3, Secure Design and Programming, the rules of the code. Look, there's no magic wand for system security, but there are some battle-tested best practices. The textbook lays out 10 secure design guidelines. These cover things like basing your decisions on an explicit security policy, using defense in depth, failing securely, balancing security with usability, logging user actions, and compartmentalizing your assets. Now, Edgevo students, listen up and grab a pen. You absolutely need to commit at least 5 of these guidelines to memory for your final exam. That's a guarantee. Let's zoom in on a couple of the absolute non-negotiables right now. First up, defense in depth. Circle this, highlight it. It's a must-know definition. Defense in depth simply means using multiple overlapping security mechanisms so you don't have a single point of failure. The idea is if one wall crumbles, another is standing right behind it to stop the attacker. A brilliant everyday example of this is multi-factor authentication. Sure, you need a password, but that's just layer 1. You also need that temporary code pinged to your smartphone. A hacker might crack your password, but unless they also pickpocketed your actual phone, that overlapping defense keeps your system
system perfectly safe.
Another massive concept is knowing how your system behaves when things completely fall apart. And that brings us to fail securely. This means designing your system so that they lock down the second a failure happens. If a component crashes, it must never, ever just throw its hands up and grant unauthorized access. For instance, if a server temporarily drops its connection to the authentication database, the fallback plan should be to instantly deny all access requests. You don't just leave the front door wide open because the lock broke. It has to fail into a secure, completely locked state. We also have to talk about Guideline 7, specifying the format of system inputs. This is huge. One of the easiest ways attackers get in is by feeding a system completely unexpected inputs that force it to behave maliciously. If you don't strictly specify and validate exactly what format an input should be, attackers are going to hit you with SQL poisoning, basically injecting database commands right into a standard logging field. Or they'll trigger buffer overflows, which is a major, major headache if you're writing your programs in C or C++. The golden rule here, always validate your inputs. You know, security vulnerabilities are actually super closely tied to just general program reliability. Think about it. A program that crashes all the time is usually a program that's incredibly easy to hack. So let's quickly jog our memories back to Chapter 11 and the 8 dependable programming guidelines. Remember those? Limiting the visibility of information, checking all inputs for validity, having solid exception handlers, and crucially, checking those array bounds. It's simple, highly reliable, rock-solid code inherently supports strong system security. Attackers are constantly hunting for sloppy, unreliable code to exploit, so let's not give them the satisfaction, okay? All right, moving into Section 4, the security testing battle, proving a negative. Okay, here's a question to chew on. We all know how to hunt for standard bugs, right? But why is security testing fundamentally totally different? Why do the experts always refer to it as an asymmetrical battle? Well, it all comes down to the simple fact that security testing is just fundamentally harder than standard reliability testing. As a tester, you're given the impossible task of proving a negative. You have to somehow prove that the system shall not be hacked or that unauthorized access shall not occur. But how do you prove a system won't do something under literally every conceivable bizarre circumstance? You can't. Meanwhile, the attackers, who, let's be real, are highly intelligent, highly creative adversaries, they don't need to understand your whole system. They don't have to play by the rules. They literally just need to find one single tiny loophole to break in. It is a completely asymmetrical fight. Because we're fighting this uphill, asymmetrical battle, we rely on 4 very distinct types of security assessment to hunt down those vulnerabilities. First up is experience-based testing. This is checking your system against known vulnerabilities using established checklists, like just making sure you haven't left the door open to basic SQL poisoning. Second is penetration testing. This is the fun one, where you actually hire ethical hackers to actively go on the offensive and try to break into your system before the actual bad guys do. Third, we have tool-based analysis. This means deploying automated static analyzers to rapidly scan thousands of lines of source code for weak spots or weird anomalies. And finally, formal verification. This involves mathematically proving that the code is secure. It's incredibly effective, but it is also insanely complex and super expensive, so you usually only see it used on the most critical, high-stakes systems. And that brings us to Section 5, our Chapter 13 exam summary, what you need to know. All right, Edgevos students, grab your highlighters because we are moving into a rapid-fire review tailored specifically for your exams. First, recall the absolute bedrock of security, the CIA triad. That's confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Literally every security threat out there is an attack on one of those 3 pillars. Also, never forget that deciding how much security to implement requires a risk assessment. Security isn't just a fun technical puzzle. At the end of the day, it is a hardcore business and financial decision based entirely on the value of the assets you're trying to protect. Now, let's clear up a super common trap that students fall into. Do not, I repeat, do not mix up authentication and authorization on your exam. They are not the same thing. Authentication is the process of identifying who the user actually is. It's the system verifying your identity, usually asking for a password. Authorization, though, happens after you're authenticated. It specifies exactly what that newly identified user is actually allowed to do within the system. Are they allowed to read files? Can they edit them? Can they nuke an entire database? You absolutely need to know the difference. Okay, here is your direct, no-nonsense exam focus. You need to be able to do 3 specific things flawlessly. Number 1, list at least 5 of the 10 secure design guidelines. Number 2, Clearly explain the definition of defense in depth, and ideally throw in a brief example to prove you get it. And number 3, explain exactly why security testing is an asymmetrical battle and why that makes it fundamentally harder than standard reliability testing. If you can confidently articulate those 3 points, you are going to absolutely crush this section. So, as we wrap up this explainer on Chapter 13, I want to leave you with this thought. Building secure software is a never-ending, exhausting arms race against incredibly motivated attackers. Vulnerabilities are always going to exist for sure, but by mastering these architectural trade-offs, strictly applying those secure design guidelines, and relentlessly testing your code, you're building a rock-solid first line of defense. Study hard, apply these principles in your projects, and ask yourself, are your programs really ready for the front lines? Thank you so much for joining me in this masterclass today, and best of luck with the rest of your software engineering studies.